Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jenna Carvana, a curatorial associate in the Department of Painting and Sculpture of Europe, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this program made possible by the Mickie Silverstein Endowed Fund. As a brief reminder, please silence your mobile devices before we begin. Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this afternoon's program, Jeff Nigro. Jeff is both a research associate in the arts of Greece, Rome, and Byzantium, and an adjunct lecturer in interpretation here at the Art Institute of Chicago. In his capacity as research associate, he assisted co-curators Lisa Chakmak and Catherine Roth with the exhibition Myth and Marble, Ancient Roman Sculptures from the Torlonia Collection. Jeff also teaches adult education seminars at the Newberry Library and is a frequent speaker for the Jane Austen Society of North America, where he has formerly served as regional coordinator for the greater Chicago area. His essay, Georgian Fangirls, Women and Castrati in 18th Century London, appears in 2023's Women in Music in the Age of Austen, edited by Linda Zionkowski and Miriam Hart. Now please, join me in welcoming Jeff to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jenna, for the lovely introduction. I also want to thank the Mickie Silverstein Endowment Fund for sponsoring this program and welcoming so many members of the Silverstein family here today. Mickie and I worked together at the Art Institute for many years, and she was an amazing person, and I'm so glad that her legacy lives on here at the Art Institute. And I also want to thank all of you for coming out in this brutally cold day so that we can imaginatively go to 18th century Naples for a look at the Art Institute's Neapolitan Crèche, which has become a holiday favorite here at the museum and in Chicago. The crèche is currently on view in Gallery 207 upstairs, and it will only be visible for a few weeks as it is every year, and usually in early January, they put a wall in front of that space so that you won't be able to see it until at least next November. It is an extraordinary piece for us to have because it feels like a very complete set for a Neapolitan crèche. And we use the word crèche, this French word, crèche, to describe this scene of the Nativity of Christ with shepherds, Magi, wise men, kings, whatever you want to call them, and angels, but also so many other figures. The Italian term for this would be a presepe, which is the term for this, for a crèche. In fact, this would be more specifically what we would call a presepe di palazzo, because it is very palatial. We used to think of this kind of art as folk art, but in fact, it's much more sophisticated and much more complicated than that. As we'll see, some major sculptors working in 18th century Naples worked on the figures or designed the figures for these kind of Neapolitan presepe. The Art Institute contains over 200 figures that includes people, angels, animals, and objects. Most of the human figures and angelic figures are made of a sort of wire armature wrapped in hemp and string, which then have painted heads, usually painted terracotta for the heads, painted wooden hands and feet, and some quite remarkable clothing, which is 18th century, and most of which was specially woven at the San Leuccio textile factory near the Royal Palace of Caserta within the Kingdom of Naples. Naples, I should mention, in those days was the capital of a kingdom which is officially referred to as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. It's a complicated reason why it's called that. I don't have time to explain. But it included about the southernmost quarter of the Italian peninsula plus the island of Sicily. And it is in Naples, specifically under the Bourbon monarchy, that these presepi, or these creches, became very much a Neapolitan specialty. As I mentioned, this would be considered a presepe di palazzo. This is the very high-end kind of display, with all of these figures that include not only the biblical figures, and you can see they can be hard to find. It's like, where is Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus, and all those characters? They can be a little difficult to find. They're sort of up towards the top, slightly off-center. This is very 18th century, very late Baroque, very Rococo. Got to go with just a little bit of asymmetry and putting things a little bit off-center. Not to mention the Baroque aesthetic, which is not less is more, it's more is more. The more the better, the more you can fill up the space. But you can see these sacred figures up here just off-center, Mary, the Christ child, Joseph, some of the Magi and their entourage, and I'll be talking about a number of them. But these kinds of creches also include a whole other set of figures, which depicts a bunch of sort of local life. There are people of all different kinds of professions, people of different social classes, mostly sort of what you might consider common people, who are engaged in a variety of activities, vendors, musicians, there's a little butcher shop. There's all kinds of people who fit into these entire presepe or crèche settings, including all of their various activities. This sort of collapsing of past and present, this inclusion of both the sacred figures from the biblical story, from the story of the birth of Jesus, combined with all of these other figures, are very much part of how these Neapolitan creches operate, bringing together past and present, the sort of the here and now combined with the there and then. The figures themselves, as if you look at here is the immediate sort of Holy Family. You can see the Christ child reaching out from Mary's arms towards the oldest Magus, the oldest of the kings. And I'll say a little bit more about them in just a minute. This is very typical for art going back to the Middle Ages and Renaissance, in which the Christ child interacts with the oldest of the kings by all sort of social rites of this time period, or of many other cultures and time periods. The child should be sort of considered inferior to this old man. He's a king, he's an old man, he's a wise man, he's a scholar, he's an astronomer, all of these other things. And yet it is the Christ child who is greater than the king. And so the oldest king kneels in reverence to the Christ child. You'll notice also, and this is something that you'll see again, as you can see just a little bit here, the beautiful setting that was put together for this crèche, which was created by contemporary Neapolitan artisans, mostly made out of cork, which is then painted, but it includes some remnants of the stable where Christ is born. It's a rather palatial ruin of a stable setting, and this is something that also goes back through art history, but also through legend, the legends that developed around this story. But I point out once again that these sculptures were not made by little, craftsmen sitting in their homes. These were designed by some of the leading artists working in Naples in the 18th century. For example, we have a number of pieces in our crèche who are credited to this sculptor, Giuseppe Sammartino. This is Sammartino's most famous sculpture, the Veiled Christ from 1753. And you see this very beautiful transformation of marble into flesh and fabric, and the complicated interaction between the body and the drapery that covers it. These sculptors took that same sophistication and brought it into the creation of these crèche figures. If you look at the angels, for example, They are also wearing silk and satin garments, which have then been stiffened with copper wire to give the illusion of fluttering drapery flowing around these angels, and also their wooden wings, which are then painted in this variety of colors. Are the colors significant or symbolic? It can be very difficult to say. Sometimes they're just there for the sake of visual variety and visual splendor. You can also see the top part of the palatial Corinthian column and entablature of the ruin where the stable is, because a legend developed, or various legends developed over the course of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, that the stable where Christ was born is actually built into the ruins of an old temple, sometimes said to be an old pagan temple, sometimes said to be a Jewish temple from the time of David or Solomon. And either one of these versions of the story is symbolic in some way. You have Christianity sort of triumphing over paganism one way, or in the other interpretation, you have the foundations of Christianity, the revelation of Christianity built into the foundations of Judaism, of the Hebrew Bible that preceded it. And then on the right-hand side, you have the shepherds. And we have a few shepherds, but I really want to point out one in particular, and he becomes one of the stock characters in these Neapolitan creches. He even has a name. His name is Benino. And there's various, again, stories about him and how he fits into this. There was a piece that was first performed in Naples in 1698, which was called La Cantata dei Pastori, or the Cantata of the Shepherds, in which this figure of Benino appears as a character. And he sleeps through the Annunciation to the shepherds, where the angel comes to tell them that this child has been born in Bethlehem. And he sleeps through it. But you might take that to mean poor guy doesn't quite get it. He doesn't get the revelation of the birth of Jesus. But in fact, when Benino wakes up from this experience in the cantata, he tells the other shepherds that while he was sleeping, he had a dream about the birth of this extraordinary child who would come to save the world. And so he still gets the revelation, but he got it in the form of a dream. The Art Institute Crèche actually contains two Benino figures. This one, which is 18th century, and there's another one. When you're facing the crèche, go to the right-hand side of it. And in a little cave just under where this Benino is sleeping is another Benino figure. But he has to be in the dark because he's 17th century and he's all made out of wood and he's quite fragile. So he can't really deal with the light too much. So he has to be in his own little cave, but be sure to go and look for him and find him out. In addition to the shepherds, of course, you have the three Magi, the three kings or the three wise men, whatever you would like to call them. In our crèche, they are this figure I already mentioned, the oldest of the Magi, and this figure here. Now, the Magi are where these medieval legends really ramped up. I mean, this is where the medieval imagination really went to town. With coming up with many stories about the Magi. They were not only given names, the gifts they brought were considered symbolic. Gold, a suitable gift for a king. Frankincense or incense, a suitable offering for a god. And myrrh, which was used to anoint the dead, as a symbol of an immortal human. And so when you consider that all of those are various facets or aspects of Jesus, king, God, and mortal doomed to die, you have the symbolism of these gifts. But beyond that, the Magi were assigned all kinds of other properties, again, 3 being such a magic number. And I put up as a point of comparison this exquisite little painting up in Gallery 207, which is the, I'm sorry, I said the crèche is in 207. It's not, it's in 204. This is in 207, and it is by the Netherlandish painter Jan van Scorel. And you see a similar kind of appearance of these 3 kings, here, here, and here. Now, on the one hand, the Magi were a great excuse for medieval and Renaissance and later Baroque artists to represent figures, a variety of figures. They always have a huge entourage. They wear the most gorgeous clothes. There are horses and other animals, and it's all very grand and very luxurious. But the Magi were also assigned other properties as well, since there were three of them. They were taken to symbolize the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Charity being the virtue of one's old age. You can't take it with you, so you might as well give it away. But also, they represent the three ages of man, or of humanity, youth, middle age, and old age. And they also represent what medieval Europeans, at least, knew of as the three continents that they knew of. So they also represent Europe, Asia, and Africa. And so very often, one of the Magi, usually the youngest, is represented as being of African ancestry, of being black. And this is true of the Neapolitan Crèche as well, as here is the youngest black magus. Now, the thing about Naples in the 18th century was that it was the largest city in Italy at the time and one of the largest cities in Europe. It's very difficult to gauge the population, but several 100,000 people lived within Naples itself. It was a thriving port city, which also meant that it had a large and very diverse population. And keep that in mind, because some of the stock characters of the crèche are people who come from various other places, as well as locals. And so that is an indication of how ethnically diverse the city of Naples was. And so here you see a close-up of this magus, and it is, he would have, Neapolitans in the 18th century would have seen and experienced Africans and people from Eastern Europe and many other places just on the streets and within the life of the city itself. Now, when you move to as you're looking at it, the left-hand side of the crèche, you have, again, this image of a bustling town, lots of activity, lots of people, music being made, people dancing. We'll see a detail of that. What is going on here? What are all these people doing here? Except that it can't be. Is it Bethlehem? Is it Naples? Is it ancient times? Is it the 18th century? What is happening here? And again, this is very much a part of these crèches, is that they include all of this various kinds of figures and various kinds of activities together. Now, I think one way to understand it is, once again, when you look at earlier images, especially medieval and Renaissance images of the Nativity or the Adoration of the Shepherds, or particularly the Adoration of the Magi, as you see here in this painting, attributed to an artist named Raffaello Botticini, not Botticelli, different person, but Botticini was also an artist who worked in Florence in the late 15th century, just to confuse things even more. But the people in these earlier times did not see these sacred events as taking place in some other time and some other place. They didn't think about, a lot of these people didn't actually go to the Middle East, didn't actually go to the Holy Land, although Jan van Scorel, who did the Adoration of the Magi that we saw, apparently did, but most of them did not. And so they imagine these sacred events as taking place in the world that they know. This explains why you will see 15th, 16th century Netherlandish paintings, say, of the Annunciation, with what looks like Bruges outside the window. Or here with Botticini, you have some Tuscan hills in the background, and apparently the Magi have arrived by ship rather than camel. Again, you have one of these palatial, classical-looking ruined stables. But you also have these Magi and their entourages coming from various various parts of the world. And so this collapsing of past and present, it's not a geographically accurate or archaeologically correct vision of the adoration of the Magi. This is about the timeless truths of these stories. And so these take place in the world that the artist and the artist's audience know. Even when you see something that it looks a little bit more, and we don't like to use the word exotic anymore, but certainly they would have seen it that way, namely a giraffe back here in the right side of this painting. There was a baby giraffe that was shipped to 15th century Florence by the Khedive of Egypt as a gift for Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent as he's often called. That giraffe, the poor thing, had died a few years before this would have been painted, but the memories of her were very long, and people had made sketches of this giraffe, and so appropriately she pops up in this painting, presumably connected to the entourage of the Magus who comes from Africa. As I mentioned, these scenes of celebrating, of the activity of life going on, the Neapolitan and other figures being inserted into this or sharing the stage, let's say, with the sacred figures of the birth of Christ, you have certain stock characters that appear in crèche after crèche after crèche, and we can identify them. Here are two examples of these two women interacting, both of them attributed to some very important artists working in 18th century Naples. This figure on the left, most prominently on the left here, attributed to Matteo Bottiglieri, and on the right, this figure attributed to Francesco Celebrano. The woman on the left in the red skirt with the blue apron is the Procidan woman, the woman from Procida, which is an island sort of in the Bay of Naples. And it's the way she's dressed, but it is also when you think in terms of 18th century Naples, you have to realize that they're doing a lot of ethnic stereotyping, and it may not be stereotypes that people are familiar with in the United States in the early 21st century, but you have to, this is the way they're thinking. The stereotype is that women from Procida were particularly beautiful and very sort of alluring. And so that's how she is supposed to be represented. The woman on the right is, again, one of the important stock characters in Neapolitan crèches. She is a chestnut vendor. And so she's selling these chestnuts, which are being cooked in this portable stove here, and she is also holding a fan presumably made of raffia, which would be used to literally fan the flames, to keep the flame going, to keep the chestnuts hot. As such, she is emblematic of the month of November, which is when the chestnuts would be ready to be cooked and sold in 18th century Naples. And so she's associated with the sort of the beginning of the Christmas season, of that sort of Advent season. Just as further behind, there are, you can't see them well in this slide, but you can see them in the crèche, this butcher shop that I mentioned, which is symbolic, emblematic of the month of January. This sort of, you don't have a lot of fresh produce in January, so you have to live on the meats that you've stored and are able to cook. So these figures, again, typical stock characters. On the balcony of this inn is presumably the inn that there wasn't room in for Mary and Joseph, but it becomes a kind of contemporary for the artists and audience Neapolitan inn. And so figures are dancing, presumably dancing a tarantella, which is a classic dance of this part of Italy. And then you also have in an adjoining balcony, you have another pair of stock characters, these two card players, two old men playing cards. They even have names, Uncle Vincenzo and Uncle Pasquale, or Uncle Pasquale. And if you are of Southern Italian or Sicilian descent, Southern Italian descent, you probably have at least one of these in your family tree somewhere. But they are also symbolic, again, they're considered to be symbolic of the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And they're sometimes also called the two Johns, because the feast of St. John the Baptist is near the summer solstice and the feast of St. John the Evangelist is near the winter solstice. I was trying to look up to see if the hands they're playing, the cards they're displaying, have any kind of symbolic value. I couldn't find anything. If somebody knows how to read the tarot or whatever, let me know, because it wasn't clear to me. Another kind of stock character, and in this case you will find some of these in the entourage of the middle-aged or Asian king or magus, she's called La Georgiana, the woman from Georgia. This is Georgia in the Caucasus, in sort of Eastern Europe. As a friend of mine likes to say, this is Georgia, not Georgia. And she's actually, again, this was the stereotype, is that women from Georgia are particularly beautiful and very attractive, especially to Turkish men. This was the stereotype, which is why she's wearing largely, why she's wearing largely Turkish dress with these red boots and these sort of baggy pants. And also, there's some other kind of figures, and this was the best I could do. I was hoping for close-ups of some of these other figures, but all the way at the right of this slide in the very bottom, there's partly cut off, are two figures. One is a Samaritan woman, and the other, you see a man here in the very lower right with a sort of fur cap and a mustache. He is an Albanian. There were a lot of Albanians in 18th century Naples. Particularly, there was a royal regiment of this sort of royal army, Royal Neapolitan Army, which was made up of Albanians, and they were considered very striking and very attractive, partly because they wore these dashing mustaches at a time when most men were clean-shaven, most fashionable men were clean-shaven. Naples, I should mention, was a great place for music, as we'll see in just a moment. But if you're an opera lover and if you're familiar with Mozart and Da Ponte's opera Così fan tutte, which Lyric Opera of Chicago is presenting this season, in the original libretto, the story is set in Naples, and there are two men who, on a bet, disguise themselves to seduce each other's fiancés. And they disguise themselves as Albanians. And you may be wondering, well, why Albanians? Nothing against anybody who's of Albanian ancestry. But in 18th century Naples, Albanian men were considered real sex symbols. And that's why they're considered particularly attractive to women. And that's why they do it this way. Now, I mentioned opera and I mentioned music. There are lots of musical instruments in the crèche and people playing them. Again, these are stock characters who appear in many, many of these crèches. These, we have, they were called posteggiatori, these itinerant street musicians. This one playing a guitar, what's called a chitarra battente, which is particularly good for strumming. We have on the other side, on the right of the screen, there is a zamponiaro. He's playing a zamponia, which is this kind of bagpipe. He's one of the shepherds. Bagpipes are particularly associated, not just in Naples, but in 18th century Europe in general. They're associated with pastoral subjects and pastoral themes. And so he's one of the shepherds appropriately. And in the center of this slide, this is part of the entourage of the Magus, the king who comes from Naples. You have a janissary, which is this sort of nickname for these guards, Turkish guard units. And he's playing what in English is usually called a Turkish crescent, which is a kind of these little bells on this kind of structure. The French name for it translates as a Chinese hat because it looked like a Chinese hat. But in 18th century England, they often referred to this instrument as a jingling Johnny. All of these musical instruments in the crèche would have been made by professional musical instrument makers. Again, this is not folk art. These are people who were doing this very professionally. As I mentioned, Naples was a great center for music. There were 4 huge conservatories of music in Naples, which trained composers, instrumentalists, and singers, including the famous castrati. These composers were trained to do, and they created sacred music, serious opera, and comic opera, all interchangeably, comic opera being considered a particularly Neapolitan specialty. And if you can think of the crèche as being in that same spirit. You have sacred figures, you have grand manner figures like a serious opera, and you have all these kind of figures of the streets and of the life of the city, which is what you would get in a comic opera as well, all sort of mixed together, no distinction between sacred and secular or between high and low. And there are also lots of animals in the crèche, and I would love to show you all of them because they're all wonderful. But I just pick a couple of examples. There are some sheep, but there are quite a few goats, as you can see on the left of this slide. Some of the breeds of goats represented here are now extinct. So it is very fascinating to see them represented in artistic form like this. There are quite a few dogs. There's one just in the lower right of this slide on the left. And then there is a monkey being sort of on a chain holding a piece of fruit of some sort. This is a motif. It's not only sort of, again, a little bit of a kind of exotic animal that would have been known to the 18th century Europeans because these little monkeys were being brought in from elsewhere. But also, it's something that symbolically goes back to, again, the traditions of nativity paintings and representations of adorations of the Magi, back to our painting attributed to Botticini. And you can see on the lower left of this slide, there's a monkey on a chain. This is symbolic of the fact that, you may think monkeys are cute, but in earlier times, they were viewed as sort of, because they're like human beings, only very badly behaved human beings. And so they were taken as kind of symbolic of sinful beings, of sort of sin. And so the idea is that with the birth of Jesus, this sin is now being chained. It's now being contained. It's now being tamed. It's, sin will be forgiven and cured, and we will rise above our sins because of this. And the monkey in the crèche, as you can see in the detail on the right, holding the fruit, then becomes a reference back to the temptation in the Garden of Eden and the beginning of the whole process of, according to Christian belief at least, of human beings entering into a state of sin which Jesus will get them out of, and that's the idea. The crèche, this was, just to say finally, that this was not one single set originally, or rather our crèche set is not that all these figures have been together since the 18th century, even though they are 18th century figures. They were put together by Vincenzo Porcini, a dealer who started collecting these objects working in Naples beginning in the 1960s and 70s. What happened was that after the unification of Italy in 1870, and now Italy is under a monarchy headed by the House of Savoy. The House of Savoy came from the far northwest of Italy, and as in other countries, there's a lot of snobbery and condescension from north to south. And so these Neapolitan traditions were looked down upon, plus the fact that the new unified Italian government had, let's say, a fraught relationship with the Vatican and the Catholic Church. And so there is a greater tendency to want to do a kind of separation of church and state, which means also a separation of the sacred and the secular. And therefore, it was decreed that you could not display creches like this with all of these figures. All you could do was to have the biblical characters, the Holy Family, the shepherds, and the Magi, and you could only display them in churches. You would not have all of these other figures, all of this, the other stock characters and all that. They're all supposed to go away. But of course, these figures lived on somewhere. They were locked up somewhere in people's collections and so on. And so you were not supposed to have, you just had to have the sacred pieces. Then during World War II, there was a crèche or presepe that was on view at the Royal Palace of Caserta outside of Naples. It's often referred to as the Neapolitan Versailles. It's enormous. That set was damaged in bombing during the war, and that's what led Neapolitans to say, this is an art form that we have created and we have cultivated, and we need to revive it. And this led to a revival. This led to people, most notably Mr. Porcini, putting together this fabulous collection, bringing together all these objects as they came on the market. And the Art Institute acquired the entire set, including this case, 19th century case with an 18th century organ case decoration on the top. Acquired it all together, and we acquired it in 2013. It's been on view every year except for 2020 at holiday season, and so it is on view once again, and it will be on view until early January. So I want to thank you for your kind attention. Oh, thank you. Thank you.